Next up, what I wanted to do is join a last year file that is smaller to a this year file, which is bigger. I'm going to summarize them first, and we're going to summarize on vendor number, and then we're going to do these joins of these two files. And I'm going to show you the differences between a primary join, a secondary join, and then a primary and secondary join, which will help us show the differences. But also, I want to then improve on that join by creating a final calculated vendor number field, which uses the primary and secondary table in the results. And this will make more sense in looking at an actual example in ACL, so let's go there now. Therefore, in the SEG duty test, we're looking for situations where the vendor create user is the same as the invoice create user. And that's a segregation of duty issue because a person could create a phony vendor and then they could create the invoice for that vendor and pay themselves and no one would know. So we like to look at this test. What I normally find with this test is that there is a manager or high-level supervisor that does have this type of access, but it really should be monitored, and it should be very rare that they're using this. Another time it does come up is if there's a small department and the person has to do everything. And again, this is a case where it does still make a lot of sense to take a look at any new vendors that are created. Are there any major payment trends with ones that have just been created by the same person that there's an invoice for? So there's a lot here that you can test. When we look at the actual data, we're going to make sure that that vendor create username is in the vendor master file, and it's also the invoice create username is in the payment file. And we're going to join the payment file in this first step to the vendor table. And by doing that join, we're going to be doing it on vendor number, and we're just trying to see, do they match? And that's kind of step 2 here. Once I've joined on vendor number and gotten the vendor name brought over to my paid history file, I can extract if the vendor name is now equal to the invoice enterer name. So in switching over to ACL, I noticed that there is a script I created called SEG DUTY, but I first wanted to show how to build that script. And one way to do this is to go into your log. This is how I generally do it. And I like to create a new session, and I could call this SEG DUTY test. And now that I have this session open, I can open up the file that I first want to take a look at, which is the paid invoice file. And in opening up that paid invoice file, I notice that somewhere in here we have the enterer initial. And that enterer initial is who entered that particular invoice. I also notice if I go over to the vendor master file, and this is sample data. Most of these do not have an enterer, but there is this one vendor down below here that does have an enterer, and we'll look at that one as well. So the goal right now is for us to join the paid file to the vendor master file, and I'm going to do that on vendor number. So I'm going to basically select data, join tables, and I'm going to select the vendor master file, and on vendor number, I just need to find that in both files. That will be the key field that I'm joining on. Now, you don't have to worry as much these days with the newer versions of ACL, but I always like to make sure that the field is the same length that I'm matching on and the same type or format, in this case ASCII. And in the primary field position, I will actually just bring over every field. And in the secondary field position, I'm going to bring over the vendor enterer. Just in case I don't have all of my vendors in the vendor master file that are in my invoice file, I'm just going to be a little careful and say include all primary records in this join. And that's in the more options. And I will do this to a new file called joined. Many times I will use a common name like joined
or extracted or summarized if that file is going to be overwritten over and over, and this is no exception. So with this set, I'm now creating this combined file where I'm going to grab the vendor enterer field and bring it over into this paid file that we started out with. So this is my joined file that now that I look over to the right here, I will have a vendor enterer whenever there was one, and there were a few here where you could see that JL starting to show up like we saw in the vendor master file. So what we can do now is an extract statement or a filter. In this case I'll just do a filter, and by selecting the edit view filter I can look for where the enterer initial, which is the invoice version of the enterer field, is equivalent to the vendor enterer field. And again, it's always a good idea to take a look when you're matching two fields just to make sure that they're the same length. Here it's 2 ASCII for vendor enterer, and for enterer initial as well. You may want to use the sub function if we needed to convert that as an option as well. But because they're the same type and the same length, we can hit the OK button. And we will see that there is one vendor, the water company, that has been set up by the same person who has also set up that vendor. Now, I always find it interesting once I find these situations to take a look at other invoices that have been entered by the same person. So let's take a look at where the enterer initial now equals JL, which was that 2-character field for all of the invoices. And now you can classify, just to take a look at, well, how many vendors does this person enter invoices for, and then based on that you can make your own conclusion as to what other invoices you may want to sample beyond the ones that are the clear segregation of duty situations where the enterer of the vendor equals the enterer of the invoice. So if we take a look at the log that's been created, we can actually select everything in that seg duty item that we created, and I like to right click that and say save selected items to a script, and we'll just call this seg duty test version, and that will create a script. I'm just going to move up from my tables folder up to my scripts folder, and in looking at the script it's a little disjointed here. There's a little bit going on here. Let me just clean this up. First off, we open up the paid invoice file. We then open up the vendor master file secondary like we talked about. We join the vendor number with those fields listed here. And just as a quick note, a simple thing you can do is highlight all those fields if you want to bring everything over and change that to the word all. So that's a lot easier to read when you're looking at your code. And okay, let's go back. So with vendor enterer and primary to joined. Now what I like to do at this point, and it happened down here, I'm going to bring that close secondary command to be after my join command. It's always a good idea to have a close of the secondary file so that if you try to join another file, sometimes ACL will not allow you to open up two secondary files at the same time, and then hence an issue. So what we could do at that point is that join statement is now built for us. We can then set the filter as noted here. We could classify that. We could then set the filter and then classify that, and this script will run. I mean, up front here, as shown previously, we would like to add a set safety off, and then at the bottom we'll have a set safety on. So again, a cleaner version of the script, trying to quickly do that because the reality is I've already built this script for you, and it's something that you can very easily right click and run just like we did with other scripts. And you can again select the paid invoice file, select the vendor file. We'll do a couple of steps here. It'll say, select the vendor number, and the vendor enterer field, and you'll select that and it'll continue. But I'm going to cancel this for now. All I can say to you is that you can run that seg duty test not only on the data that's provided, but also on your data as well.
Now let's explain how to take the paid invoice file and the prior paid invoice file and join them together in a primary and secondary way. So let me just first, before I do this, I'm going to summarize the paid invoice file on vendor number. Just keep this real simple, and we'll create a table just called ven sum new, and I'm just going to accumulate that invoice amount, vendor number. Very, very simple. This is the ven sum new. Now I'm going to go to the prior paid invoice file, and I'm going to execute the same command, which I can do by going to my log and selecting the summarize command in my log, making sure that the command line is shown. But instead of it being new, I'm going to say old. And then that will create this other file that now I have ven sum new and old. Now notice the old has 26 records or 26 vendors, and the new one has 32 vendors. So just keep that in mind as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to join these two tables together. It'll take just a second because of the small size of these files, and we'll take the two vendor numbers as the key fields. I'm fine with actually bringing over all primary and secondary fields. Now, I'm not going to do anything here. I'm just going to set this up in a standard way, if you will. And we're going to do this to a new file called joined matched. Now, what it's going to do is it's going to take these 32 records, match it to the ven sum old. Now, there were 26 records in the old, and again, the 26 records in the old match the 26 records in the new, and I have a joined match 26 records. But again, keeping in mind, it's only, there were records here that we lost in that comparison. So notice here we have the primary file, secondary file set. I'm going to go back to my log, click on that join primary key button, and then I'm just going to click this edit command. And now that I have it edited, I do have the pre-sort secondary or primary. I'm going to go to my more button, and I'm going to say include all primary records. And we'll do this to a joined primary. Now I have my 32 records, and any time that there's a situation where there's a blank here, meaning that the vendor number in the old file does not exist, keep in mind this was the new file that we had primary. These are the secondary fields, which ACL has now added a 2 to that field name because it's exactly the same field name as the primary. And notice the 2's. So we now have this table here with a bunch of blanks in between there. Just to kind of finish the exercise here, just to go back, I'm going to go back to the ven sum new. I have my ven sum old. Go back to my log, go to my last statement here, which had the primary in it. I'm going to go edit command. And in the more button, just for right now, we're going to say include all secondary records. Now, I do know that there are not vendors in the old that should be carried forward to the new. I know that they're not there, but if they were there, those would then carry over. And we'll kind of put a primary, secondary here. Those would carry over, and if there's, let's say the 161500 did not exist in the primary table, the new table, this would be blank, yet this would be here. So just to show you the three different join statements, join matched, join primary, and join secondary, and why you want to use them. I personally find, and you find that Microsoft Access uses a joined primary approach as the staple, because you never want to lose records from your original file when you're joining it to a secondary one. So I think joined primary you should always be using, except for when you're looking for matches and only matches, which does happen in a lot of the tests that we do. So you need to know the difference, I suppose, between the two. But I do find don't lose records, and remember that as you're working with your files, and that's how this joint primary and secondary can help you in that exercise. Just to tidy up this final join primary and secondary table, I want to show you how to improve upon this vendor number field. Now, the invoice amount and the count, if it doesn't exist as you have here, you have the secondary being blank or zero in this case. So that's okay. I mean, and actually for our analysis, if I want to, do some calculations now on these fields, they'll have some zeros in that case, but there's no real issue in doing this. Now, the vendor number field though is a little annoying because is it this one? Do I need to look at that one? What we can do is we can create a calculated field, and we're going to call this vendor number new. And the default value, I will use this vendor number field. However, if the vendor number field, and I might want to just do an all trim just to be safe here, equals one blank space. Again, if all trim will get rid of all blank spaces in that field, if it equals just one blank space in that first primary field, we'll then put the secondary field in there of vendor number 2. So in vendor number 2 would be the old value. Now that I have that calculated field set up, let me just close this. I can add the vendor number new to my view, and sure enough, we actually have now this fully calculated field. I can get rid of these, mind you. And now I have an analysis that looks quite nice, and this has more, all vendor numbers, new data, old data, all nicely lined up for analysis.